I think sometimes when we talk about adoption in especially evangelical circles, we don't use very careful language around it. And it can be really painful for adoptees because we turn adoption, like, contemporary adoption of children, into something that feels a lot like a salvation narrative, which is really confusing for adoptees. I'm actually not convinced that Paul's adoption texts are particularly helpful in conversations about contemporary adoption because he's talking about a really different kind of thing.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the CPT podcast. I'm Zach Wagner. Today our guest is Dr. Erin Heim, who is a tutor in biblical studies at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. We are talking about her story of faith and education, as well as her story of her own adoption and her then research on adoption and the theme of adoption in the Apostle Paul. Let's get right into the conversation.
Erin Heim, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We are delighted to have you. Although, Zach, I'm the only one this side of the Atlantic. This is crazy. I'm talking to both of you in England. In fact, in the same town, same sleepy little town in England.
Not sure if Oxford qualifies as sleepy or little.
That's my Cambridge.
Yeah, that's a bit more Cambridge. That's a bit more Cambridge.
Exactly. Well, it's great to, Erin, have you on the show today, and we have a ton to talk about. We're going to need to sort of organize our time and stay at it because I want to hear about your music degree at the University of Minnesota. I want to hear about your PhD in New Zealand. I want to know if you visited the Lord of the Rings movie set. I got to ask you right off I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. Did you go to the Lord of the Rings movie set?
To be honest, the whole country kind of feels like the Lord of the Rings movie set.
All right.
There are just with more sheep, and so we did when I was in my second year. We went to Wellington because we had our daughter was born in New Zealand, and when you have a child abroad, you have to present the child to the consulate. So we had to go to Wellington.
Marvelous.
And we stayed in this. Yeah, it was really neat. We stayed in
marvelous.
This like.
They just put you in the Hobbit
VRBO? No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we had to rent it. So we went, we rented this VRBO. And the reason that we wanted to stay there was because the film with Lady of the Woods was it was filmed at this location. So I've been there.
Wow, fantastic!
And obviously some of that's like CGI and whatnot, but that was pretty cool. And then the Remarkables in the South Island are the setting for so much of the running scenes. And I wasn't in anyone in particular, but it's pretty spectacular scenery.
Spectacular scenery, isn't it? Yeah. Well, we'll come back to University of Otago and your experience down there. But let's start. Were you born and reared in Minnesota? How did you get to University of Minnesota as an undergrad?
Yeah, I was.
Where do you come from originally? You were?
Yeah, so I grew up in Bloomington, Minnesota, which is just a suburb. Minneapolis. And my family's from like Western Minnesota, Renville and Sacred Heart, Minnesota, farming country. And my parents moved to the city. So I did a music degree at the local university, I suppose. Thought I wanted to be a music teacher. I have a degree in music education and trumpet performance.
So trumpet is your instrument, huh?
Yeah, the one that I'm good at anyway.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, marvelous. And how was your experience at University of Minnesota? Did you enjoy it?
I had a wonderful time as a music student there. It's very much, it's a community of musicians. And in many ways, I think it prepared me for the world of biblical studies. I was one of two. Yeah, I was one of two women in my trumpet studio. So it did never occur to me to be like uncomfortable, I guess, in a room full of men.
Yes.
Until maybe
that wasn't what I expected. That's just not the direction I expected that going when you said it prepared me for the world of biblical studies.
I mean, I could talk about diligence and practice and, all of those things too, and creativity. Yes. But really, that was a significant,
wow.
I have reflected on that a lot, but that actually was a really helpful experience. yeah, anyway.
That's fascinating. And did you grow up in a what was your kind of faith background, Erin?
So I grew up in a home that, when I was a child, at least, was nominally Catholic. My mom has now since become, since my teenage years, when I developed a much more robust faith, has become a much more devout Catholic.
Wow.
My dad is, he grew up, my family's like culturally Lutheran on that side. So yeah, we have, good spiritual conversations, but I struggled sometimes to use the language of conversion, but because it gets kind of a little bit confusing about like Catholic beliefs about baptism. And now I work in an Anglican seminary, or an Anglican theological college. So I think I'm, a little bit conflicted about the whole thing, but I had a, genuine come to Jesus experience as a 15-year-old, and have been, walking with the Lord faithfully since then, most of the time.
What was the context of that, Erin?
The context of that was, to be honest, I'm adopted. And so a lot of adoptees go through a pretty significant kind of identity crisis as teenagers. Yes. And that was true of me also. So I was kind of in the depths of depression. I was in the depths of depression as a 15-year-old. And had a group of Christian friends, and most significantly, my then boyfriend, now husband's mother, kind of walked alongside me through that. And Jesus was in the midst of that. I kind of say it that way, and kind of reached down into the depths, and I felt overwhelmed with God's love, overwhelmed with the love of Jesus, when I felt completely unlovable. So, yeah, so that's amazing. Yeah, so that's kind of how I, became a Christian, and
but not your standard.
No, not standard.
Well, I was going to say not your standard kind of like grew up in a Christian home, teenage revival event in youth groups sort of thing that I think a lot of people who end up in biblical studies, if they have a faith journey, if they're, your generation, my generation, that's a lot of people's story was like, I grew up in a Christian home, didn't really make the faith my own. Then when I was 14, we nailed our sin to the cross, and then, it's a little different for you.
Yeah, it is a little different. And I should say that my journey to the academy was also a little different. I didn't really, it's funny to say this now, but I didn't really set out to be a New Testament scholar. Yes. I followed my husband, when we graduated from college, from university, he felt called to go to seminary, felt called to be a pastor. Wow. And so we moved from Minneapolis to Denver, and I taught music for a year, and then felt God calling me to go to seminary, but not really kind of having a clear idea of what that was going to look like. So I think in my youthful naivety, was like, well, I'll go and I'll train and I'll be a really educated pastor's wife. Yes. I love teaching. I love school. Maybe that's not surprising for how I ended up. So I thought, well, and then Denver Seminary does something kind of shrewd, and they offer spouse degrees at half the cost of the originally. So I'm like, I'll get a master's degree out of this, and it'll be like half the cost. So we were in seminary together, which was a real joy. And then I took Greek for fun that first semester, and then I was hooked from there.
You were hooked ever since. That's excellent. That's excellent. Did you and your boyfriend, who has become your husband, go to University of Minnesota together?
We did. He's older than I am.
At the university together. Okay,
yeah. So we met in, this is so quintessentially American, but we met in high school marching band. He also plays the trumpet. Awesome. Yeah, we stood next to each other. I know. So that's how we ended up together.
Todd and his wife Todd and his wife Katie also met in high school and went to college together and all that. So you guys
started dating in high school, Zach. We met in kindergarten.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's right.
We go way back. I had
forgotten.
We went to the 8th grade Christmas dance together. We go way back. So it's even nerdier, Aaron, than your story.
Yeah.
Or sappier, at least. Oh, that's good. So Aaron, you're at Denver Seminary. You are teaching music, but you're tucking in a master's degree on the side. You take Greek. You get hooked.
I stopped teaching music, so I quit my day job and then went to study full time, so I could finish the same time he did.
I wanted to ask a quick question. Do you see you talking about how you're reflecting on the way music prepared you for biblical studies? One of the things, I don't know if you're making this connection, but a thing I make connections on is the study of music, particularly music theory, musical notation, things like that, and ancient languages. I think there's a decent amount of overlap there. Do you agree with that? And
go ahead. Yeah, I think that's a good shout. I think for two reasons. One, there's like an amount of detail that you need for, especially theory. Yes. And I found theory really, like, this probably sounds a little bit perverse, but fun. I really enjoy music theory. And I think also what's neat about the more advanced you get in theory, the more you realize that there's kind of a creativity. I mean, there's obviously a creativity to composing. I don't really do that, but there's also a creativity to interpretation. And the more that you know about music theory, the more, the better a player you are, because you're aware of like the structure of a piece and where, your part, if you're a trumpet player, fits, or where the, where the chord progression is going and how how the melody line relates to that. So, knowing the theory gives structure to your creativity in a way that I find really analogous to Greek, where it's a language, so it's not a math problem. That takes the whole beauty out of the study of ancient languages, but there is structure, and if you know the confines of it, then there's kind of room to think and to express. So I do find very analogous. Yes.
Oh, I love that, and I'll say I took piano lessons for like 8 years when I was growing up. And I felt like the actual physical manifestation of playing piano, I was never especially good at, but I did like the theory bits of it. And I always felt like that was analogous to the fact that I've always been like a grammar nerd from when I was really young. And that has translated into, I think, a real fascination with, and I don't know, to some degree, an aptitude for ancient languages, particularly the way ancient languages are taught and how it's like, there are downsides to this, but it's so grammar heavy and analytical in the way that languages are taught. But there's also this artistic element to it that I think is analogous to music, like you're saying. It's interesting. My wife also has a music education degree.
Yeah.
And she'll be writing something or working on something, and she'll ask for my advice on like, what do you think of the use of this preposition here? And I'll say, well, it depends. Is that instrumental or what? And she just kind of, her eyes rolled it into the back of her head. But like that sort of nerdy grammar stuff has always been interesting to me. And I think sorry for that sidetrack there, but I think there's something really significant to the overlap between music and language.
This sheds a lot of light on my personal life, Zach, because as you know, I never learned how to play any instruments, and I was never very good at ancient languages. So this is now all making a lot of sense.
Yes.
So, Aaron, get us back to Denver Seminary. What was your master's degree in?
New Testament.
Oh, it was in New Testament. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. An MA, was it?
Biblical interpretation with an emphasis in New Testament, but it's a master's degree in New Testament. Yeah.
That's great. And
sorry, there's another question in that.
I was going to ask if it was an MA. Was it an MA? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, it was an MA.
And where did you go from there? How did your story unfold from there?
My advisor at Denver Seminary, who is still there, although he is nearing the end of his career, is Craig Blomberg. And Craig has been a huge support and champion for me and a number of other students along the way. But I really appreciated him because the second year, I took 3 years to finish because I didn't have a background in biblical studies. So the second year he said, I really think you should think about doctoral work. And so he encouraged me to explore that. One thing that was really important to my husband and to me was to go to a fully funded program. And another thing that was important to us was to try to go overseas if we could. And that limits your options by quite a lot. So that's how we ended up.
Those are actually like mutually exclusive oftentimes, like fully funded or overseas. Yes.
Yeah. Although in Australia and New Zealand, there is actually a lot of money floating around for PhD students. So we ended up in New Zealand because it was interesting. My husband said, I have the same sort of feeling about New Zealand as I did about coming to Denver. Like God seems like he might want to do something with us here. So I applied to study with Paul Trebilco. And I cannot say enough about Paul as a supervisor. He's
a Cambridge grad.
He is.
I had to throw that. Zach, I had to throw that in.
Yeah,
there.
And he's one of.
I had to throw that.
Well, and he's also a Kiwi, and then he was also one of James Dunn's students. So that,
is that right? Okay.
Yeah, that pedigree is kind of it's a good mix, I think. So Paul is really interested in working, when I was there anyway. Now he's got a different project that he's doing, but he was working on self-designations among Christians in the New Testament.
Wow.
So
excellent.
how does language shape, or what language do people use, and what can we gain from understanding people's designations? And then in subsequent years, like right after I finished, he finished another book on the language for outsiders. So it was a really good match in that way for some of my own research interests about how language shapes how we think and whatnot.
That's marvelous. How many years were you down in New Zealand?
3. Yep, just 3.
Great. That's great.
Because they cut off your funding after 3 years.
Yeah, that has a way of moving you along, doesn't it?
You better be done after 3. Right?
Well, I mean, you can carry on, but they won't.
And
fund
you had a child while you were in New Zealand.
I had 2 children while we were in New Zealand.
Wow.
Because it's expensive. Sorry, kids, but it's expensive to have babies when you are in the American healthcare system, and it's free to have babies. In fact, they pay you in some interesting ways to have babies in New Zealand. So yes, both of my children were souvenirs. And
similar in the UK, by the way. Yeah. I had more than one person when they found out. Actually, I don't think she'll mind me saying, Jennifer McNutt, who's a CPT fellow. She's in one of our fellowships here. She was a professor of mine at Wheaton. But when she found out that we were moving to England, she's like, "Do you guys want to have any more kids? They're really cheap to have
the baby there."
Yes. So
yeah, and I suppose most people, most of my fellow postgraduate students who are international students, if they had babies, it was their wives who had babies, not necessarily the students. So I'm not sure if I would recommend this as a
yes.
Yeah, Aaron, I got to ask, you were there for 3 years working on a PhD, of course, and had 2 babies in 3 years working on a PhD.
Did.
How on earth did that work? I mean, that's mind-boggling to me.
Well, one, you learn to be really efficient with your time.
Wow.
So I just, when it was time to work, it was time to work. And a lot of times I'd be reading and, taking care of a baby at the same time. But the other thing is my husband was, hugely helpful and stayed home with our daughter 2 days a week. And I would work 3 days a week because he pastored then. So Sunday was a work day for him. And so, it was, he was on a 75% contract or something like that. And it just, you make it work. So we made it work. My son was born 5 weeks before I finished. Actually, I was done by the time he was born. And then just kind of waited and fiddled with my thesis in order to submit it at the
Did
right
you defend
time.
with a newborn in tow, or?
No, so you don't have to defend a thesis in New Zealand or Australia. They're starting to introduce them, but it's not part of their academic tradition. So it gets evaluated by 3 examiners, and then they can request a viva.
Okay.
Or you can request a viva, but if no one requests a viva, then you don't have a viva.
I would imagine you
Yes.
didn't request a viva.
I
You
didn't
weren't
at that
sitting around
stage.
craving the viva experience.
Yeah, man, I really wish. Yeah.
Gonna get gypped if I don't get one.
People do.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's a chance for you to, most of the time it's a pretty positive experience. It's a chance for you to interact with seasoned scholars who have not supervised your work, who have read it really carefully. So I would have, in hindsight, it would have been really fun to have a viva. My examiners were an internal examiner and then Lynn Coick and Beverly Gaventa. So having
marvelous.
a viva with them actually would have been really great.
Seriously.
But I was like 2 months postpartum when I got my results. So I thought, it's okay. I'm fine.
You got enough going on.
Yeah.
I was gonna just underscore one thing from what you were saying, and I think this has come up in conversations that we've had with various people on this podcast, but it bears repeating that getting a PhD is very much a team project oftentimes, and you need the buy-in and the support of your partner or your spouse. And I'm hearing that
for sure
in your story.
Yeah, or your mother who also
kids.
comes
Yes.
and helps. Yeah, my mom
Yes.
actually. It's a remind that. Yeah, I should shout out to my mother who came and lived with us for like the last 4 months, so I could.
Oh,
wow.
did you
Yeah.
really, Aaron?
So I could, finish and submit without having to spend late nights that I was not capable of doing.
Amazing.
Yeah,
well, that is super impressive, Aaron, that you were able to pull that off. Obviously, a team effort and a very kind of committed, generous husband and mother. But that is just incredible. Wow, that's amazing. Most of my colleagues, male colleagues who were not bearing children while they were working on PhDs, I mean, they went more than 3 years, so that you're able to pull the whole thing off and in time and keep it moving is amazing.
Hey everybody, just a quick note about the CPT's annual theology conference for 2021. The theme this year is Confronting Racial Injustice, Theory and Praxis for the Church. This event will take place on October 18th to 20th at Calvary Memorial Church just outside of Chicago. Plenary speakers include Charlie Dates, Eric Redmond, Esau McCulley, Raymond Chang, Cherith V. Nordling, Gregory Thompson, and Love Seacrest. You can register and find more information at cptconference.com.
And you worked on adoption in Galatians and in Romans. And when you said you were adopted earlier in the podcast, it was kind of like, wow, incredible. And I'm really intrigued to hear the connection between your own personal story of being adopted and your academic research. I assume it wasn't random. You didn't just throw a dart at a board and say, oh, adoption in the New Testament or in Pauline theology. That's interesting. Talk to us about how you developed that theme and research interest and how it connected to your own personal story. And you talked about being in a tough spot when you were 15 and processing your own adoption.
Yeah.
If I can use this way of putting it, was there therapeutic value in the rigor of research and New Testament study in this? What was the connection there?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And I think it's important to say that adoption is not something that you ever run away from, so even as an adult, each stage of my life, my adoption means something different to me.
Yes.
Now as a mother, that was a catalyst for more reflection. So yeah, this was certainly not an accident. I wanted to research adoption because adoptees, I think, have a desire to understand this thing that happened to them. Because I think there's this, and I also want to say that I think sometimes when we talk about adoption, in especially evangelical circles, we don't use very careful language around it. And it can be really painful for adoptees because we turn adoption, contemporary adoption of children, into something that feels a lot like a salvation narrative, which is really confusing for adoptees.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about
talk
that?
a little more about that.
And by the way, Aaron, just my background, I'm the adoptive parent of 4 children, so I'm intrigued with what you're saying here.
And I think this is I was just going to say, pastors talk about this a lot from the pulpit. So I just want to underscore that. So I think your experience of that is important to hear.
And it's a perspective that's often kind of missing from the discourse on adoption. The adoptive parent perspective is, quite well represented. There's, prominent books by adoptive parents on the theological significance of adoption, not so much by adoptees. And I think the reason for that is that, adoption, even when it goes really well, and mine went really well, I have a wonderful relationship with my adoptive family. It's still, it's a traumatic thing. There's loss there. And significant loss. And you don't ever, it's not like that ever goes away.
Yeah, even in the best of circumstances, Aaron, I mean, just to underscore that, even in the best of circumstances, this is no slight on your experience or your relationship with your family or whatever. Absolutely. It's just even in it
there's always loss. And it's complicated. You feel like there's no question that I belong in my family.
Yes.
But I also don't. Yes. Like there are visible ways that I am different when we have family gatherings, and just personality wise, I'm the only musician in my family. There's all those kinds of things. And then that makes you, constantly reflect on like, well, am I like other people then? Because I don't have a relationship with my biological family, my first family, because I was adopted in the beginning of the 1980s at kind of the end of the baby scoop era. Anyway, so I just think we need to be aware of that kind of trauma that adoption causes. Yeah. And I don't say that to, certainly, adoptive parents are, I think in general, doing the best that they can to parent, but sometimes, really well-meaning theological language can go really, really, awry and be really damaging to adoptees, because when we talk about like contemporary adoption, the way that Paul talks about our adoption as children, all of a sudden you've mapped a salvation narrative onto my traumatic experience. And that's really painful. So I guess I went to kind of understand that. I have come to a place now, having been researching this for, I don't know, whatever it is now, like 10, 11 years. I'm actually not convinced that Paul's adoption texts are particularly helpful in conversations about contemporary adoption, because he's talking about a really different kind of thing.
Yes.
Which, I could definitely nerd out for a little while and talk about adoption in ancient Rome and all of the different things, all of the ways that that's different. I guess to make a long story short, Paul's talking, the institution he has in mind is the adoption of adult men by an heir. It's a lot more like naming a benefactor than it is anything else. And certainly it creates family ties, but it's not about rescue of vulnerable children in any sense, really. And I think it's important. We miss that then when we preach that text on Adoption Sunday. We miss that, and all of a sudden, our story of deliverance from the sin of the sin and slavery becomes about it becomes about rescue of vulnerable children, and those things are different. And I think we should speak about them differently. So that's kind of my little spiel on adoption from an adoptee.
Do you have any plans, Aaron, to do something? Obviously, you published your dissertation. Do you have plans to do something a little more accessible and
wait, my dissertation's
and even theological?
Not accessible? Oh, I mean, it's going for the bargain price of like $175 or something.
Yes, exactly.
And that's the only thing inaccessible about it, sadly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's a good question. I think eventually I'd like to co-author something with a friend of mine who also is adopted and also kind of has similar theological roots. I think that would be good. But honestly, this is going to sound kind of bad, but like adoptees don't get we don't get offers to speak or write about adoption very often, because quite frankly, it's kind of a bummer.
Yes.
It's just, we get asked to speak once and then they're like, oh, I thought you were going to say something really different. And then we don't get asked again. So
Zach, we need to get her to do something for the CPT website, my man.
On adoption. That'd be great. No,
yes.
I was thinking so just even as you were talking, and this is something that's the way we talk about and frame up biblical metaphors, even I think particularly in preaching, there can be kind of this like sacred cow dynamic to it, where like certain things preach really well, and like correlating what you're saying, Aaron, this is what I was thinking while you were talking, correlating like our adoption into sonship with Christ as like the rescue of vulnerable children, that preaches pretty well. And I think it makes pastors feel good to preach about, and it makes congregants generally feel good. Like, oh, wow, what a beautiful image. I'm this vulnerable baby that's been abandoned, and Christ is, so it's kind of like, and maybe I'm not sure if this is exactly what you were saying, but that can kind of like not feel great to say, yeah, maybe don't preach it like that, because people like preaching it like that. And then that's not an especially popular, but maybe that underscores the need for this project to be more accessible for pastors and preachers and Christians.
Yeah. And I certainly don't want to like diminish Paul's words in Romans 8. They are, that's the best. We can all just agree that's the best chapter in the Bible, right? Sorry.
Right at the top.
Right at the top. No. But it's a tremendous statement about good news. And I don't think, it's not because really Paul's depiction of us is way darker than vulnerable children. Like that's, that maybe we should bring that
Vessels
back into
wrath.
That's the next chapter. But the idea in Romans 8 that like the person who has the mind of the flesh cannot please God, that's that's strong language. That's not vulnerable baby language. That's like, enslaved or dominated, or, you're like, we're more culpable than that. And we're in more bondage than that. And anyway, so I think there are good theological reasons to not use vulnerable baby language, even if you're not preaching on Adoption Sunday. I think my bigger issue is like the leap from God did this for you, so you go do that for other people. And a lot of times that gets talked about like, we have, vertical adoption, so you should do horizontal adoption. But from the perspective of an adoptee, we don't have horizontal adoption. We have like a mini vertical adoption, And what it feels like then is, and I use this word carefully, but like when we put the narrative on it like that, it feels a little bit like idolatry, because we made this mini God. We've made this mini salvation story. And then it just like adoptees, when I talk to them about this, like it feels icky. That's the best word. Like you feel like your story has some sort of special theological, spiritual significance that you didn't ask for, but people are propping up as if it's, the like phrases that get thrown around, like the gospel in my living room, or it's not comfortable, and it doesn't give us the space to say, hey, we have some, questions, we have some trauma, we have some things that we need to process through. Please don't tell us that this is uniformly good news, or that we should, only feel grateful.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the CPT podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for the rest of our conversation with Dr. Aaron Heim. Thank you for listening to this episode of the CPT podcast, a theology podcast for the church. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider throwing us a like, sharing the podcast online, subscribing, leaving a review. Anything like that would go a long way towards helping other people hear about the podcast. The CPT podcast is a ministry of the Center for Pastor Theologians. You can learn more about the CPT by visiting us at pastortheologians.com. You can also find us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our host for today's episode was Todd Wilson. Our producer and editor was Trenton Jones. Our music was composed by Andrew Gerlicher. I'm Zach Wagner. Thanks for listening.